It's very nice to join you. How is the Eternal City?
It's nice, as always. Probably it might be nicer, but no, it's the city itself is okay. The situation is difficult. The general situation.
How is the vaccination program going?
Slowly, but it is going. Whereas in the UK, it's going very well.
It's going extremely well. It's now a third of the adult population have been vaccinated. All the main priority groups have been vaccinated. And, you know, I think this will just carry on now at high speed right through until the summer when everyone will be vaccinated who wishes to be. And the take up amongst the high priority groups has been very high. So although some younger people have not been as enthusiastic about having a vaccine, elderly people, the people in the priority groups have been very enthusiastic about being vaccinated, and it's gone very smoothly. It's about the only thing that has gone smoothly. The test and trace program did not work at all well. So there were many problems last year, but the vaccination program is going very well.
Good. What kind of vaccine are you using in the UK?
There are two kinds. One is the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. That's the first, and the second is the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. We've ordered large amounts of other vaccines as well. And I think that, I mean, increasingly people seem to assume that we will need not only a booster vaccination in the autumn, but quite possibly a vaccination every year for a few years as the mutations of the virus continue.
Good. So I think in a few moments we can start our conversation. I would like to do the following. I'll make just a very short introduction. Then I'll give floor to Lord MERVYN King for 20-25 minutes speech. Then all our discussants will have 8 minutes each for their remarks, and we will go with Daniele Capezzone, Rainer Masera, Giulio Terzi, and Giulio Tremonti. Then I would ask also Paolo Savona to making some remarks if he agrees. Probably we will have with us also Afonso Pastore, former governor at the Bank of Brazil. And so maybe Afonso Pastore will want to make some remarks, and then Lord MERVYN King will reply to everybody, if you agree. Is it fine, this program?
Yep.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Perfect. I didn't see, by the way, Ambassador Terzi. Is Terzi with us?
Here I am. Here
Okay.
I am. Great pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Carli. Thank you to all the others. It's a great honor to be with you.
So thank you very much. So in 1 minute from now, I think we can start our webinar. So Paolo, anche tu intervieni alla fine, giusto?
Yes, very shortly.
Perfect, thank you. Very good. Okay, so I think we can start. Are we ready? Are we on air? So, good evening, everybody. We have the privilege of having with us Lord MERVYN King and some extremely distinguished panelists. So tonight my role will be easier because our guests need no presentation. I will make just a short introduction of this webinar. On September 10th, 2019, in Genova, we organized a conference, The European Economy in the New Global Order. We had the honor of having with us Lord MERVYN King. Pierluigi Ciocca, Luca Di Donna, Rainer Masera, Paolo Savona, and myself prepared some remarks to his speech. Few weeks before that conference, John Kay and MERVYN King submitted to the final manuscript of the book Radical Uncertainty to the publishers. In Genoa, Lord King started his keynote speech by saying, I take the book we published, he said, "We live in turbulent times. The economic and political climate has rarely been so fraught since the end of Second World War. Ripples on the surface of our politics have become breaking waves as the winds of change have gained force. Few countries illustrate this more vividly than yours, Italy, and my own, UK. But this economic and political turbulence has now become a global phenomenon. This has been said in September 2019. Italy was then in the middle of a political crisis, and we are just coming out from a difficult political crisis today. COVID-19 meant nothing in September 2019. The world economy has been severely hit by the pandemic, and we are getting through a deep recession. So the disequilibria and unbalances that Lord King were referring to in Genoa became even more acute. Turbulence and uncertainty dramatically increased since then. The West under radical uncertainty, Britain, Europe, America is our webinar today. Britain, Europe, America are facing different challenges, in many cases related one to the other. These challenges do refer to the international relations, international trade imbalances, low productivity, financial instability, lack of investment, social tensions, polarization of our societies, stagnation of real wages and declining of life expectancies, demographics and migration problems. These problems were all clear in September 2019. Now, the entire world is facing two additional and common challenges. First, exiting the pandemic. Second, exiting the recession, which means return to sustainable growth. This evening, we'll try to figure out how our policymakers and advisors of our policymakers should deal with an unknowable future where there is the need of a consistent decision-making strategy aiming to give responses to all these challenges. We refer to the new global order, and there is no need to mention the role of China, the role of Britain after Brexit, the new American administration, the weaknesses within the European Union, the fact that in 1 year from now, Mrs. Merkel will end her office in a global environment which is very unpredictable and fragile, Middle East, Russia, South America. So, Mervyn, I give you the floor, and we are all very happy to have you again with us.
Federico, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join you and others at the Guido Carli Association for this webinar on the West under radical uncertainty. After my talk, I shall look forward with interest to the discussion. In January last year, the International Monetary Fund forecast that the world economy would grow in 2020 by around 3.5%. In January this year, they revised their view of growth last year to minus 3.5%. This turnaround in estimates of growth of the world economy in the year ahead by 7 percentage points must count as one of the largest forecasting errors ever made. Of course, it's perfectly understandable. The forecast didn't take into account the possibility of the pandemic through which we are still passing. But it illustrated the fallacy of believing that we can forecast the future easily. No range of uncertainty was given, nor could easily have been calculated. And there were no different scenarios presented by the IMF, and no probabilities were attached to the forecast. On the 30th of January last year, the World Health Organization declared that COVID-19 was a public health emergency of international concern. And a year later, over 100 million people have contracted the disease, and the death toll is rapidly approaching 2.5 million. When John Kay and I submitted the final manuscript of our book, Radical Uncertainty, to the publishers in the summer of 2019, we wrote, and I quote, "We must expect to be hit by an epidemic of an infectious disease resulting from a virus that does not yet exist." You might think that we demonstrated an unusually high degree of prescience. You would be wrong. Knowledge that a pandemic was likely at some point in no way enabled us or anyone else to predict when or where or what type of virus would emerge. COVID-19 is a classic example of what we call radical uncertainty. It isn't a black swan event. That is something which is impossible to conceive until it happens. We all knew that pandemics were possible, even likely, but there was no way in which one could attach probabilities to events such as a virus will emerge from Wuhan in China in December 2019. And the attempt to do so would have proved a distraction from the more important challenge of how to improve the resilience of public health services better to combat such an epidemic whenever it might arise. A similar argument can be made about the folly of trying to predict the precise moment when a financial crisis might occur, compared with the crucial importance of ensuring that the financial system is sufficiently resilient to withstand the kind of events that we saw in 2008. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of the failure of economic forecasts is not that the forecasts themselves are largely useless, but that they continue to be made. The fact that there is still a high degree of uncertainty about the nature and path of the current pandemic did not prevent the IMF from making yet another precise forecast of growth in the world economy in January. It's almost as if uncertainty is seen as something occurring in the past, but not in the future. Over the past year, we've seen many politicians, epidemiologists, and economists only too willing to make forecasts in order to justify their policy positions. Their unwillingness to confront uncertainty has dangerous consequences. The pretense of certainty means that not only do we fail to prepare for plausible future outcomes, but we ignore important information that might help us make better decisions. Uncertainty exists when we have incomplete information about the future, or even the present, and sometimes the past. Some of this incompleteness we can resolve by looking up the answer in a book or on Google and other online sources of information, if and when we need to know the answer. Other uncertainties we can describe as the outcome of a well-defined lottery, such as tossing a coin or rolling a die in a casino, where the possible outcomes can be described in advance and the probabilities of each of them are known. Uncertainties of these kinds I call resolvable uncertainty. They can be tamed by mathematical calculation, but they account for only a small fraction of the problems that we confront. In contrast, radical uncertainty is any uncertainty where we cannot enumerate a list of all possible future outcomes to which we can then attach probabilities. Most important personal, business, financial, and political decisions are of this kind. They reflect unique situations in which we know something, but not enough to attach probabilities to a set of future outcomes. Although COVID-19 was neither the first nor the last pandemic to hit the world, it was sufficiently different from previous episodes to make it impossible beforehand to compute a probability of its arrival in 2019 or 2020. And the global financial crisis of 2007 to 9 is another example of radical uncertainty. History is littered with banking crises, and so it was likely that at some point another such event would occur. And in the run-up to the crisis of a decade ago, there were indeed signs of stress in the financial system. But those concerns, although they should have prompted action, could not have been expressed in the form of a probability that, for example, Lehman Brothers would collapse in September 2008. The distinction between resolvable and radical uncertainty is similar, but not identical, to the famous distinction between risk and uncertainty, which originated exactly 100 years ago with two economists on opposite sides of the Atlantic, Frank Knight in Chicago and John Maynard Keynes in Cambridge. I simply refer you to the book which John Kay and I published last year. For my purposes today, I simply want to stress that the existence of radical uncertainty explains why both economic and epidemiological models have been misused and have led to an unfortunate degree of bogus quantification. And to illustrate this, I want to discuss some of the important challenges facing the United States, Europe, and the United Kingdom. Each of these three areas faces their own distinct challenges. The biggest challenge facing the United States is the impact of China on the world economic and political system. The great decoupling between the two largest economies in the world is leading to a competitive battle for both economic success and global leadership. No doubt the new Biden administration will reach out to its traditional allies as the US enters a new stage of competition with its global rival. Whether it will be able to establish a peaceful modus vivendi with China remains to be seen. Biden has already stated that the United States intends to pursue, and I quote, extreme competition, end quote, with China. Although neither country can see any attraction in extending this economic and technological competition into the sphere of military conflict, the unresolved position of Taiwan is likely to pose a serious problem. President Xi has been as clear as he could that not only Hong Kong, but also Taiwan are purely internal Chinese matters. But the United States could hardly acquiesce in a forcible integration of Taiwan into China without losing its position as a major power in the Asian region. None of us can know how this will be resolved before the key date of 2049, when the People's Republic of China celebrates its centenary. Europe does not face quite such existential challenges, but its continuing energy dependence on Russia and the failure to resolve the debate over whether or not to construct a permanent fiscal union in the euro area illustrate the underlying tensions between the European Union as an entity and its constituent member nations. The failures of the European Commission in respect to the acquisition and distribution of vaccines are merely the latest example of the fact that the European Union remains a work in progress. And the United Kingdom has now to face up to the adjustments implied by Brexit and the centrifugal forces on the four nations of the United Kingdom created by the experience of trying to cope with the pandemic. These challenges are more political than economic, but no less serious for that. But despite their own unique problems, the three regions, US, Europe, and the UK, also share major economic challenges in common. And it's on these that I want to focus this evening. Two challenges seem to me most significant at present. First, how to handle the emergence of our economies from the damage created by the pandemic. And second, the urgent need to reallocate resources within our economies in order to return to a path of sustainable economic growth. And in both cases, I shall argue that the failure to appreciate the importance of radical uncertainty has been responsible for mistaken analysis. No country has found it easy to manage the pandemic. Even those that appeared to be more successful in suppressing the virus last spring have struggled during the second wave. And new variants of the virus have sprung up, challenging the modeling of the epidemic and the development of vaccines. The differences between countries aren't fully understood. Rich countries in Europe have apparently performed worse than many poor countries in Africa. It seems the most effective measures to defeat the pandemic have actually been almost pre-scientific. The centuries-old remedies of separation, which we now call social distancing, quarantine, and the closure of borders. Our ability to treat the disease and develop vaccines are certainly advanced, but our ability to prevent transmission is little further advanced than in the time of Boccaccio when he wrote the Decameron. More immediately, the debate on macroeconomic policy is confused because of a failure to be clear about the reasons for the size and speed of the economic downturn. Output has fallen because of government-mandated shutdowns and decisions by households to protect themselves by not going to work and by not spending as usual. When a government curtails economic activity for reasons of public health, it doesn't make sense at the same time to try to boost activity with monetary and fiscal stimulus. The case for a large fiscal response is not to stimulate spending, but to enable businesses and the self-employed to survive while maintaining employment. In Europe, that support has been provided through furlough schemes, and in the United States by relief for the unemployed and other transfers. Such support will be required until we escape the fear of large numbers of deaths from COVID-19, with all restrictions lifted and confidence restored. What is needed is therefore temporary support for those affected by the immediate consequences of COVID-19, not a longer lasting fiscal or monetary stimulus. This difference between stimulus and support is important. Last March, central banks purchased large quantities of assets to prevent dislocation in normally liquid markets for government instruments. But those purchases were not reversed when that temporary dislocation ended. And the result is that monetary aggregates are now growing very rapidly. In the US, M2 rose by 26% between January last year and January this year. In the euro area, broad money, measured by M3, rose by 12.5% in the year to December. And over the same period, broad money in the United Kingdom rose by over 13%. These are eye-watering numbers. In contrast, quantitative easing, undertaken in response to the financial crisis a decade ago, simply prevented the broad money supply from contracting. A failure to distinguish between temporary fiscal support for sectors of the economy affected by the health measures taken by governments and a generalized fiscal stimulus risks higher inflation down the road. And that is a risk looking ahead. Let me turn now to the question of the reallocation of resources. As the economy gradually opens up, the need for fiscal support will diminish, and attention should then turn to the need for a reallocation of capital and labor. For over a decade, an extraordinary degree of monetary stimulus has failed to generate growth in the industrialized economies, and excess capacity has built up in some sectors with a growing number of zombie companies and excess demand in other sectors. Overall, investment has been insufficient to absorb global savings. Now, this problem of secular stagnation has not been resolved by a massive stimulus to aggregate demand. We've seen that over 10 years. What is required now is a reallocation of resources within most major economies in order to eliminate excess capacity in those sectors which expanded faster than could be sustained, and to encourage investment in sectors with unexploited, profitable investment opportunities. Even before the financial crisis, the pattern of demand and output in the world economy had become unsustainable. The price signals, especially interest and exchange rates, that might reallocate resources from unprofitable to profitable investments have been suppressed. Escaping from a low growth trap is a different proposition than climbing out of a Keynesian downturn, and it requires different remedies. In a Keynesian downturn, the aim is to boost aggregate demand. Temporary monetary or fiscal stimulus restores demand to its trend path and can then be removed. We're not overly worried about which components of demand respond to the stimulus. But in order to escape from a low growth trap, that involves a reallocation of resources from one component of demand to another, from one sector to another, and from one firm to another. Low or even negative interest rates have permitted zombie companies to survive, and investment has been weak. In the decade following the financial crisis, gross investment as a share of GDP fell by around 2 percentage points in the industrialized countries of the G7. And as a share of GDP, this is a large fall. Now, all of this was true before the arrival of COVID-19. There are now two further reasons for wanting to focus on the need to stimulate a reallocation of resources. First, businesses and governments alike have come to realize that resilience is just as important a feature of an economy or organization as efficiency. Survival matters. We learned that lesson in respect of the banking system during the financial crisis, but we forgot to apply it elsewhere. Resilience of healthcare systems, the risks posed by just-in-time delivery systems, the susceptibility of economies to border closures, all suggest that economic activity will be organized in a different way in the future. Second, the pattern of demand for a number of services, ranging from air travel to hospitality and entertainment, will change in ways that are impossible to quantify today. There is bound to be a period of trial and error before we settle on a new pattern of spending and output. Take the example of the United Kingdom. Last year, there was an extraordinary divergence between retail sales, much of it online, which saw a strong year-on-year rise of more than 5%, and spending on services, which declined by over 15%. Amazon did not require fiscal support. Retailers forced to close their shops, and restaurants and entertainment venues forced to close their doors did. How far previous patterns of spending will return is as yet unclear. No doubt, shuttered restaurants and theatres will reopen to welcome a wave of pent-up demand. But some change in the pattern of spending is likely to persist, and that will require a reallocation of resources, of labour and capital to support the new pattern of demand. To bring about such a shift of resources will require a much broader set of policies than simply monetary or fiscal stimulus. The answer goes well beyond monetary and fiscal policies to include exchange rates, supply side reforms, and measures to correct unsustainably high or unsustainably low national saving rates. Now, from this discussion of how best to exit the pandemic and how to return to sustainable growth, I want to draw one conclusion. The failure to appreciate the significance of radical uncertainty has led not only economists, but also epidemiologists and politicians to make two main errors. The first is to focus on an imaginary optimal policy. Finding a solution that is good enough in practice is more important than searching for an unknowable optimum. And the second error is to believe that models, whether economic or epidemiological, are descriptions of the world rather than abstractions which can provide valuable insights. The pretense that it takes a model to beat a model, commonly espoused by economists, leads to an exaggerated view of what models tell us about the world and to a dangerous degree of bogus quantification. It was not only the IMF forecasts of growth in 2020 that proved so misleading. Many of the epidemiological models also produced wildly inaccurate quantitative forecasts. Decision-making under uncertainty cannot be delegated to black box models, which only a few, if any, so-called experts understand. And the pretense of certainty leads to the mistaken view that uncertainty is always bad. In fact, uncertainty is the spice of life. So let me end on an optimistic note. Radical uncertainty, as Frank Knight argued 100 years ago, is the essence of innovation and entrepreneurship, and the rise in living standards which they make possible. It's the driving force of a market economy when entrepreneurs discover and produce new products and new processes. In business, as in the arts and sciences, and in life, uncertainty and creativity are inseparable. At graduation ceremonies, I often meet students who tell me that they're worried about the uncertainty of their future. I say to them that if they could write down a list of their potential life partners with probabilities attached to each of them, and a list of the careers which they might follow, and the countries in which they might live, also with probabilities attached to each one, they would almost certainly lose any enthusiasm for the future, because the excitement of the unexpected would have been eliminated. The joy of life comes from new experiences, whether meeting new people, discovering new places, new books, new restaurants. It's the discovery of those aspects of life of which we had no inkling, that is the spice of life. The great success of the human race has never been to forecast, but to adapt to unexpected change of circumstances. Never has there been a time when the need for us to adapt has been so great. But with a spirit of humility and determination, I am confident we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mervyn, for this extraordinary keynote speech. I'm really impressed about what you said. I believe that our discussant will have many things to say. So I'm gonna leave floor to Daniele Capezzone, columnist at La Verità. MERVYN KING said he was so kind to say that Europe does not face quite such existential challenges as the US do. So I guess that Daniele Capezzone wants to start from there for his remarks.
Well, first of all, thank you for this kind invitation, for this opportunity to share ideas and views, and this opportunity to learn from Lord King's vision and experience. Among the many subjects or potential subjects of our conversation, I've been asked to talk about, and I will be talking about, Brexit and the debate we had in Italy about Brexit, and also the debate we had in continental Europe about Brexit. But I will keep some minutes in the final part of my speech for some remarks after this important keynote speech by Lord King. 4 years ago, together with my friend Federico Punzi, I wrote a book about Brexit. The title was Brexit the Challenge. It was labeled as a pro-Brexit book, and it was, of course, but even more, it was an anti-Brexit book. It was a book designed against the professional opponents of Brexit in Italy and in continental Europe. Believe me, Lord King, here in Italy and in continental Europe, there have been two bizarre assumptions in this debate about Brexit. The first one, so many politicians and pundits and experts and commentators who are skeptic on any other subject. They think that any subject can be subject to their critical scrutiny. But when it comes to the EU, to the European Union, it's a sort of dogma. They consider it a matter of religion, and they reject any objection in terms of anathema and superstition. You either worship at the altar of the EU orthodoxy, or you are rejected as a sort of monster. And the second bizarre thing is that so many pundits and commentators and experts love talking about diversity. They love saying that diversity is a blessing, but when they come to terms with something really different, for example, a different opinion about Brexit, they use the hammer of uniformity. That's a pure Orwellian inversion. They talk about diversity, but they mean homogeneity and uniformity. So what was Brexit from my perspective? From my perspective, it wasn't only a referendum or an election. From my perspective, it was, and it is, a vision, a 50-year or who knows how many year journey to reshape the British identity as a global superpower capable of attracting resources and investment. There is a painful truth in the EU to come to terms with, to cope with. Inside the European Union for decades, there have been two tendencies at war between each other. On the one hand, pro-market and pro-competition tendency. On the other hand, a medley centralizing and interventionist tendency. And unfortunately to us, the second one, the latter, spectacularly won. So from my perspective, it was natural that the British electors decided, that the UK decided to trade freely without amalgamating politically, that you decided to leave, that you decided not to accept a sort of Franco-German project designed in Berlin, Paris, and Brussels, and then imposed to all of the others. After the British referendum, there were, from my perspective, two possible reactions here in continental Europe. The first one was the one that unfortunately we had to witness, a sort of furious reaction, treating London as a sort of rebellious province. That's crazy, but this is what has happened in Brussels and in so many European capitals. The great Janet Daly, columnist at The Telegraph, was right to say, from my perspective, that only three kinds of organization threaten their departing members: mafia families, religious cults, and secret society. And we have to add, unfortunately, the EU. Someone else from the opposite side argued that Brexit might trigger some inappropriate and violent institutional behaviors. They were right, but they were wrong about the side of the channel where this would happen after what we have seen with the vaccine thing and Brussels' choices about Northern Ireland. So the time has come to choose the second possible reaction. I wish we will do so. That is to say, to accept Britain as our best possible neighbor. We have so many things to do together, from defense to intelligence to trade to the military and so on. And also from the European perspective, to use Brexit as a blessed opportunity to trigger in the EU a renegotiation of the existing rules among the 27 remaining members. How? First, pushing for a multi-tiered union in which any state can participate in or abstain from programs that suit or don't suit them. That's important. Second, promoting a sort of red card system in the EU, letting every state reject some of the regulations coming from Brussels, just as our German friends do through their constitutional court. We have to let our parliament reject some of the things that are not in our national best interest. European rules may be paramount unless they are overturned or rejected by national institutions. And third, and finally, if I might, we should prevent a Euro area finance secretary. We should prevent that with the mission of harmonizing, that is to say, to impose the final straitjacket of fiscal uniformity from Finland to Portugal, from Germany to Greece. We need, from my perspective, fiscal competition so that low taxes system can act as a model for the others. If I might, some final remarks after Lord King's presentation. What's happening after COVID from an economic point of view? From my perspective, as a classical liberal, as a free marketeer, emergency programs are easier to establish than to dismantle. Just like our liberties are easier to lose than to recover. So when people are in an environment of fear, it is natural that they should seek protection and they should look for a larger role of the state. But the problem is that once you have expanded the role of the state, it is not easy to reduce that. So my point is, on the one hand, it is natural and understandable that so many politicians at a European level and also at a national level, in Italy, this happens, emphasize the role of public plans. I understand that. And in a way, I also can agree. They emphasize the role of Next Generation EU, of this European plan to inject resources, to allocate resources, to have an assertive role of the state. I understand that. But please, let's not forget the other side of the story. We need supply side reforms. We need a shock tax cut, a short regulation cut, so that we can re-energize the private sector. We can let families and businesses make their own choice. The world is changing before our eyes. Not even the wisest politician, not even the most prescient minister can understand, as Lord MERVYN KING has explained, which sectors are looking up, which sectors are plummeting. So my point is, especially in Italy, where we are risking a sort of post-COVID socialism, okay, my point is, let's ask our politicians a sort of industrial policy from a libertarian point of view, if I might. That is to say, less government plans and more creation of an entrepreneur-friendly environment, low taxes, low regulation, so that families and businesses can spring up once again. Thank you, Lord King. Thank you, Mr. Carli, and thank you to the other discussants.
Thank you very much, Daniele, for your intervention. Now I would like to invite Professor Rainer Masera, Dean of the Faculty of Economics at Università Guglielmo Marconi.
Thank you very much for this invitation. And if I may, thanks especially to MERVYN King for his outstanding speech. We had the pleasure, many of us, to listen to him in Genova, but he has, from certain points of view, if I may, surpassed himself. I am confronted with a mission impossible because I have 6-7 minutes ahead of me, a huge type of problems which might be discussed, and therefore we are in a situation of what I would call embarras de richesse, in the sense that we must therefore be very short. My key points will be just outlined here, but perhaps I will take the liberty of putting them down in written form, and as much as I will read with care the interventions just made, I will perhaps try to offer my thoughts in a more appropriate way. Let me start with a provocation. Provocation is the following. The seminar is the seminar we are confronted with is the West under radical uncertainty, Britain, Europe, and America, as if Britain with Brexit is no longer in Europe, Now, this I'm joking, but only half joking, because I believe that things can change. If MERVYN is right, the future can bring about unforeseen and unforeseeable events. But on one thing, I'm quite sure. The United Kingdom, England, belongs to Europe, and from many points of view, Europe owes a lot to England and to the United Kingdom. Just two brief examples. Richard I of England, Lionheart. In truth, he was called during his times mostly Cœur de Lion, because he lived most of his life in France, and he decided to cross the Mediterranean to go to the Third Crusade with the full support of Genova. So much the support that the cross of San Giorgio became a key element of the Union Jack. Richard is at the heart of the Christian roots of Europe, and here again something which is forgotten. The Christian roots of Europe belong also to England and to people like Richard I. He defeated the Saladin, the Muslim, but he finalized a peace treaty for the open access to Jerusalem. My second flashback, and I take my time, but I think it is important to recall these things. I go back to 1939, which is not 100 years ago, it's 80 years ago. And there was, as we all know, but many forget, there was a secret pact between Ribbentrop and Molotov to divide Europe in two areas of influence, with the borderline cutting across Poland, which would have disappeared as an independent state. The two parts of Europe would be under the control of Nazi Germany and the communist Soviet Union. The ruling party in Italy wrote immediately a letter saying, the new order which will come from this invasion is the heart of the new Europe. Fortunately, we are not in that situation, but why? Because it was England with Chamberlain and Churchill which countered the decided to enter also, naturally, for national reasons, to enter a war which appeared impossible with Germany and the Soviet Union. And without that firm strength, firm stand and stubborn determination of Britain, Europe would not exist as we have it now. As to Brexit, you will tell me, Federico, when I have to stop. As to Brexit, I think here again we have instances of radical uncertainty. Radical uncertainty, and I just mentioned 2 or 3 points. The paradox of red tape. Nobody would have imagined, or perhaps just a few, did imagine that the key argument of levers, one of the key arguments was the exceedingly costly amount of red tape of the Brussels bureaucracy. But now it is being discovered by the UK and also by the single market that this exists only from the inside. When Brexit companies and individuals are finding that from the outside there are still 27 sets of national rules, this is something which Britain has to face now. The director of Make UK a few days ago said that concerning this point of the new bureaucracy, he said that Brexit is like Dante's 5th circle of hell for importers and exporters. The war of parcels, we all know, But more broadly and more importantly, perhaps, the relocation of productive premises from the UK to the EU is gathering momentum. And we know the story of Cadbury and others, but two issues require close attention. The infrastructure of technological transfers, with the leading role of Germany and France, and the declining, unfortunately, role of the UK. The reframing of the global supply chains, this is a different way of putting some of the arguments so brilliantly made by our guest speaker. This interacts with the quest for new manufacturing platforms in Europe and among the EU, China, and the United States. Industrial policies, Daniele, you may be right, but industrial policies are here to stay. And unfortunately, from many points of view, it is not clear to me whether the United Kingdom will continue to play this key role which it had in the past. The issue of the city is a case at hand. It is a case at hand. The governor, Andrew Bailey, if I understood his correctly, has called the EU demands for city institutions to comply with Brussels regulations unacceptable. And I believe he is right. Bailey affirmed that the EU has granted equivalence status to Canada, the US, Australia, Hong Kong, and Brexit, but it is insisting that the city should turn to EU rules. I have no time, but I think that the frictions and uncertainties after Brexit are already taking their toll for the city, but for Europe as a whole, if it is true, as I believe it is true, that we need a well-functioning capital markets union, but we are, if not destroying, certainly creating problems for the hub, the traditional hub, which is London. Recall the figures which we have just witnessed. That is to say, in January of this year, for the first time, Amsterdam Stock Exchanges surpassed London in terms of volume of exchanges. And this is compared with what happened in last year, when the volume of trade in London was euro 17.5 billion, compared with the 6 in Amsterdam. Equally important to my mind is the loss of business to a small country, but a country which is booming, Luxembourg, which is booming in terms of income and job attraction for financial services. The unity of the United Kingdom. Mervyn, you made reference to this point. I'm no judge here, but I fear that the opinion polls, which are subject to radical uncertainties themselves, indicate that the majority of Scottish voters might be in favor of a Scottish state, which would be part of the EU. The issue of Ireland is far from solved, so Wales would remain the only stronghold of the UK. And in a world which is diverging, as you pointed out, from many points of view, it remains true that large elements of decision-making in Europe belong to the EU, and we are losing your equilibrating and very important presence in the EU, I believe. I come finally, but here it would require too much time, and it would be perhaps too complex for a brief discussion of this type. Risk and uncertainty, economic science and final regulation. Your monumental contribution is welcome, is extremely important. I do not want to dwell upon it. But there is one point which should be clear to all of us. It is a mystery story, but it is not. A mystery story why Knight and Keynes did agree on some fundamental issues concerning the issue of probability, objective, and uncertainty. If I may, a similar similar conclusion was reached by De Finetti, who argued 6 years later, that is to say 1928, that objective probabilities do not exist by definition. I had the pleasure of working with John Hicks, and I made my thesis with him. Causality in economics indicates, he wrote this a few years ago, but he said something which you did not remind, but which I believe is certainly relevant to your book. When we cannot accept that the observations along the time series available to us are independent, we have in strict logic no more than one observation, all of the separate items having to be taken together. For the analysis of that, the probability calculus is useless. It does not apply. I'm bold enough, he said, that the usefulness of statistical and stochastic methods is a good deal less than it's now conventionally supposed. So a number of top economists have indicated what you restated right now. But for the reasons you explained, this just goes away. Nobody cares, and we continue to work as if the main arguments which I have just indicated were not correct. With Paolo Savona, we wrote together a book on the epistemology of economics, and we, if I recall it correctly, we reached the similar conclusions, but this does not help a lot. I myself, in my little, wrote something of this type, which was requested by the most important Indian review of statistics and banking, but which was hardly read in Europe. So my request to you is that, Mervyn, since you are fundamentally right, but it is over 100 years that these ideas are being rejected by the so-called conventional wisdom, perhaps we should focus more on these technical, analytical points, because unless you change the frame of mind of economists and policymakers, the mistakes you alluded to will continue to be repeated by economists and politicians at the same time. Thank you very much, because your book and your conference are of outstanding importance. And I recommend this book to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rainer. I would like to tell everybody, particularly to all our discussants, that the proceedings of this webinar will be published both in an electronic book and in a physical printed book. So I would ask everybody to try to stick into these 8-9 minutes, because then we will have the opportunity to publish the proceedings of the webinar. Ambassador Terzi, former Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Carli, and thank you to the Foundation. I have admired and I've listened to the very impressive keynote speech by Lord MERVYN King, and to the observation of the two discussants, Daniele Capezzone and Professor Rainer Masera, on what means uncertainty in the present situation we found ourselves in Europe, in the Atlantic, in what I tend to call as often as I can the Euro-Atlantic community, not to join the euro currency with the euro geopolitical dimension, but the Euro-Atlantic community as a point of convergence across all the policies which are affecting everyday life of the citizens of this part of the world and also the other countries, but to try to see in my short points, I would like to try to reconnect to the very interesting differences, scenarios, and the contradiction in economic policies and financial policies and monetary policies, contradiction which have been offered to the response to the pandemic and to the economic crisis that we are facing. But I would like to implement this framework, the framework of this discussion, with some hypotheses, or at least some hopes, that the post-Brexit situation and the post-COVID situation may be a great booster to relaunch, to revamp a convergence between Britain, Europe, and America, especially in the security area, in the defense and security area, and in the way our countries, our communities are approaching this dimension. Because this time is folded and shaken by the pandemic, by the economic predicament, but not only by that. Two other ghosts are wandering in the West. On one side, and that was recognized by the 2019 London NATO summit, European and Atlantic security are increasingly affected by China's ambition of global leadership in the most critical areas of economy, science, technology, military capability, and readiness. Some sinologists are even convinced, maybe it's an exaggeration, but personally don't believe it is an exaggeration, are convinced that the Chinese Communist Party aims at assimilating the West, and this, or at least its more economically and strategically interesting regions, with unrestricted warfare of political and economic tools of influence. And the other ghost wandering in our part of the world is radicalization and terrorism. And this is the most dangerous aspect. Of course, there are two major players, as I see it: the Islamic State terrorism, that is to say, the radicalization on the Sunni part of the world, and the Shia fundamentalism, directed by Iran and by organizations which are also terrorist or are mainly terrorist, as a part of the Iranian intelligence apparatus, Hezbollah and other groups. There have been really many critics who have said that Western leaders have been too often loath to admit that they were asleep for too long, in some situation giving a too quick answer to issues that instead demand zero tolerance and resolute condemnation from all countries which are ruled by liberal democracies. And in fact, it is Europe that, despite Brexit, could own reasonable arguments to bolster the existing alliances and to create new ones on the most important issues, and above all in the realm of big data, defense, foreign and security policy. And that is because the age of radical uncertainty, as it has been defined by this seminar, is also an age of dramatic power shifts because of COVID-19. And power shifts that were described by the keynote speech and by the other two discussants. But there is a big difference in reacting and to try to adjust, to respond to those challenges between our liberal democracies and other countries which are ruled differently. Because in our systems, government accountability is checked, called into question, submitted to free and fair election. And that is not a wealth that many other parts of the world own. And that is because of lacking, there is a situation when up to now, there have been a diverging of positions, or at least a lack of clarity, to say the least, among the UK, the US 27, and even the 27 themselves, and between Brussels and Washington, defining Western interest. And we have noticed time and again many cracks surging in the Euro-Atlantic architecture, cracks which are worrisome because they become even more visible when our fundamental political, security, and economic values and interests are challenged, for instance, by Russia, China, and Iran. And I venture into making an hypothesis that Brexit and COVID, for difficult they could be to face, could be also, I think it is overabused, the idea that a crisis is also an opportunity. But let's be more modest. Let's imagine that there are areas of improved cooperation in our collective security across the Atlantic and within the European Union, and first and foremost in defense. In defense, because in the post-Brexit, London will have to decide how involved it wants to be in EU defense efforts. It seems likely that the country's aim, that London's aim, will be to have flexible structure that allow it to plug into European foreign defense policy, where doing so is in its interest. And it was remarkable. And I think it was also an example for other countries in the European Union, especially those who are members of NATO, to see that Prime Minister Boris Johnson made headlines when he announced that the Ministry of Defense would receive an extra 16.5 billion sterling over 4 years on top of its annual budget set at 41.5 billion for 2020. An extraordinary decision, since it was even taken on over a 4-year period, somehow making exceptions from the general decision that the allocation should have been rediscussed for other areas year by year. And in fact, defense cooperation is one of the main areas which, facing an uncertain future due to Brexit, the United Kingdom will need to reorder its relationship with the European Union. The political, economic, and security environment in the Euro-Atlantic area after the agreement reached between the Commission and the Prime Minister, between Ursula von der Leyen and Prime Minister Boris Johnson on the 24th of December, will open up new opportunities for intensifying EU-UK cooperation on defense program, both at multilateral and bilateral level. And we in Italy are very interested, also our defense industry, very much connected with the British. And there are some areas where it is evident that cooperation will not only continue, but will be enhanced by the new situation that we are facing, especially given the emphasis on defense funding that Prime Minister Boris Johnson has put in over the last for the last budget. London, in other areas, this possibility of enhancing cooperation is reflected also in areas which are only partially related, but surely are also related to defense, like science, research in high-tech, the program which are very much significant in terms of telecommunication, use of artificial intelligence, but also to foresee a development which could allow the North Atlantic Alliance and Europeans to remain competitive with that part of the world which aims really at obtaining a position of global leadership. And I'm meaning, I'm referring to China, a global leadership in artificial intelligence, in the space sciences, and in telecommunication. There is no doubt that this is a very promising and important area. The overall relation between space, economy, and scientific research will be increasingly pervasive, from 5G to connected mobility, from smart cities to artificial intelligence. The role of both civil and military satellites is going to become more and more fundamental in European geopolitical strategies. You know, Britain is very much into this field with Copernicus. It remains part of the European Space Agency. And so there are some pillars to the cooperation between the 27 and the UK, but especially between Italy and the UK. The other areas, I'm concluding with these short remarks, just to mention that on the financial services, this is closer to the consideration which have been done up to now by the previous discussants. Financial services, there is, I'm not going to dwell on the story of the negotiations on the equivalences between the 27 and London, but there is no doubt the negotiations are ongoing, and there is a common understanding that financial services also should be an important step in the consolidation of a Euro-Atlantic influence at the global level. There are other two related issues. The global trade, we know how important it is, especially in the post-Trump era, the multilateral approach, and that is something which is very compatible with European approach, especially with the Italian approach, revamping of WTO and all the other related, for instance, the World Health Organization in terms of, it has also a very significant economic aspect because it relates to the sector of pharmaceuticals, the global chain in things which are essential to the life and safety and health of humanity, and global trade, I'm saying, and China. China, again, to mention this huge challenge that we are, our societies, our political environment, our intelligence, and last but not least, our security and defense are facing. There is little doubt among the many well-informed commentators and analysts who put their focus on the relation with China that the right answer to Xi Jinping is a joined-up China policy among Western countries, as it was defined by a commentator who every one of us reads constantly in Financial Times, Philip Stephens. And he wrote, he said, and I'm quoting him, the new Biden administration will struggle to get Europeans to adopt a more robust approach. The EU scarcely sent an encouraging message when it rushed through a unilateral investment deal with China before President Biden's inauguration. And then Stephens concludes saying a thing which is not particularly nice to Chancellor Merkel on this question of the comprehensive investment agreement with China. He said, Stephens, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, the EU mercantilist in chief, is standing down this year. So the German politics may evolve in a way which could also be compatible with an approach to a China policy more determined to promote and to defend the liberal democracies and the values which are the core of our society and our democratic existence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Terzi. Professor Giulio Tremonti, Chairman of Aspen Institute Italia, former Minister of Economy, please.
Brexit and the rest. Brexit is a perfect paradigm of complexity and uncertainty. Brexit is more or less a new edition of the schism of 1539. Schism was carry out to overcome the restriction imposed by the Roman Church in order to take advantage of the Atlantic spaces that were opening up to commercial traffic. Brexit now overcomes the legal restrictions imposed by Brussels to take advantage of the financial opportunities offered by contemporary anarchic globalization. Some other shadows coming from the past. London is a paradigm of a global megalopolis. Downton Abbey, on the contrary, is a successful TV drama based on nostalgia for the past, plus a reaction of the countryside against the global London. In the Ventotene Manifesto, 1942, a prophecy is written. In the end, Europe will prevail. All the nation states will lie on the ground like carcasses. Via referendum on Brexit, United Kingdom exits from the EU, but the EU could enter into the United Kingdom via a possible disruptive counter-referendum on Scotland, so starting a dangerous lose-lose process. More generally, today in Catalonia, tomorrow Scotland, the old European prophecy of the Ventotene Manifesto on the dissolution of nation states could be true, also because the new EU could become in Europe more attractive than before. Anyway, my personal sentiment corresponds with the sentence of Nietzsche. Europe without England does not exist. By the way, today, United Kingdom is out of the European legal architecture, but in Brussels, inside the palace, they continue to speak English, and not because English is the official language of Ireland and Malta, but because England is still in the culture and in the earth of the Europeans. The rest. Too quickly, in just 3 decades, we went from liberté, égalité, fraternité to globalité, marché, monnaie. Wealth without nations and nations without wealth. This was the title of a book that I wrote in 1992. At global level, the dominant dimension is that of anomie. Below, we have an excess of useless local rules. This global institutional symmetry pushes the world into a dangerous terra incognita. First crisis exploded since 2007. The policy, the treatment applied since then has been and is purely homeopathic, simul cum simile, adding money to money, debt to debt. Today, it is as if Picasso paints his metaphysical forms on the canvas of contemporary finance. The unit of account suddenly went from billion to trillion. The split between finance and economy now evokes, on a larger and more modern scale, risks anyhow similar to those that in 1720 led to the crisis of John Law's proto-global system. In addition, today we see 2 other emerging causes of global radical uncertainty. With the new Chinese presidency, the emergence of China from its pure mercantile dimension to a new tentative dominant global power. The pandemic. It was written, coronavirus pandemic is a human tragedy of potentially biblical proportions. Not only a human tragedy. The Bible is a fantastic archive of myths and legends. Paradise Lost, the Great Flood, the Tower of Babel. Babel is the right myth today. Man challenge God, the tower reaches the sky, God reacts, removing man's single language. Today, in place of single language, single thought is removed as a dramatic effect of the pandemic. The positive and progressive mental mechanism of globalization has been broken. Its software has been hacked, with effects extended to mental, social, economic, political, geopolitical effects. Coronavirus vaccine exists. We still don't have a vaccine against all these kinds of new negative effects. 10 years ago, in the middle of financial crisis, my copyright was, it is like being in a video game. A monster appears, you defeat it, you relax, but immediately after that, another monster appears, and it is bigger than the last one. To escape from the video game in 2009, during the Italian presidency of the G7, a proposal for a global legal standard was formulated, the draft of an international multilateral treaty. A treaty based on the transition from free trade to fair trade, setting forth rules on the production of goods and services. The GLS was approved by the OECD Assembly, but was defeated by the ideology and by the power of the so-called Financial Stability Board. Article 4 of the Global Legal Standard envisaged environmental and hygiene rules 10 years ago. Today, the video game continues. The present world is indeed the perfect habitat for other new monsters. Something, therefore, must be done, must be attempted to come back to the old suspended global legal standard or to a new version of Bretton Woods or other. The title of a book of Lord King is The End of Alchemy. Alchemy, something that evokes Isaac Newton, his ancestor in Bank of England or thereabouts. Also for the reason, the ideas expressed in that book we are now discussing, we are external interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tremonti. Before asking MERVYN King to give us his concluding remarks, I take advantage of the presence of Paolo Savona for asking him some comments. Paolo Savona, Chairman of CONSOB.
Thank you. Professor King, I am not well protected as you are. On my table, I have only Socrates, as you can see, to remember me that I know that I don't know. This is my position, especially in front of the concept, what does it mean, radical uncertainty? I think that all of us shared the view that we are living in a world of radical uncertainties. And in the last 2 years, the uncertainties have increased. We have the same huge problems of 2019, but a very different economic situation without having theories and experiences to approach it. This is my first question to you. I think that the current crisis is a pure supply crisis, which is the first time in the last 2 centuries that we are facing this kind of a crisis, which is no more concentrated on the lack in demand or an excess of supply and the problem of competition. This crisis is really different, and we have no the instrument to approach it. How we have faced the situation? First, the monetary policy started to act as a lender of first resort, not of land resort. They are buying public debt in order to help the public budget. They are supplying liquidity in order to avoid the liquidity crisis, but they have no reply for the future. At present, the discussion is centered only if we have to follow the target, the quantitative target, or to re-establish the target of rates. The second point is that the fiscal policy is feeding the drop in incomes. It's not following the classical target of full employment or to use the excess of savings. So we have two different kinds of political economy without knowing how to escape from the current situation of both policies. The last question that I am addressing to you, so I am not concluding, but raising questions, is to accept or legitimate the use of private currency. The Bitcoin is the first example, is helping uncertainty or increasing uncertainty. Why the central bank have not a clear position on this point in order to reduce the amount of uncertainty on the future of monetary policy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. I would ask Afonso Pastore, former governor at Banco Central do Brasil and chairman at CDPP, one of the most important Brazilian think tank, to make his comments, and then I'll kindly ask Lord MERVYN KING to make his concluding remarks.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you, Lord MERVYN KING, for your excellent presentation. I have to confess, when I read your book, I was immediately hooked by it. It started making me think deeper than I used to think before. Say, going back to Frank Knight and to Keynes on the question of uncertainty, and really stressing that there are uncertainties and uncertainties. We have knowns which are known, we have unknowns which are known, and we have unknowns which are unknowns, paraphrasing Rumsfeld, as you do in your book. This pandemic really is something that scientists expected it to happen, but no one thought about that it could happen in our lifetime. So it's an example, a vivid example that you cannot attach subjective probabilities to events. Now, I want to provoke you somewhat about not on the long run, like most of the commentators here, but on the next 2 years. And I would like to look at Europe and the US on the reactions they are having to the COVID, which is a strange cycle because it has hit supply and demand both. Let's say you have a pandemic that puts everything on home office. We cannot consume, we cannot work. So you contract. So it's not a classical way to reduce the depth of the cycle by increasing spending. You need to vaccinate 100% of the population as fast as we can in order to go closer back to where we were before the pandemics. And Europe and the US are doing that. It takes time, it's not immediate. But you need also stimuli. Let me take for granted that both are going to keep on with a very fast vaccination, such that in 2021 probably will be overcoming the difficulty coming from the pandemics, thanks to the scientists that produced the vaccines. Now, US is following a different path. Both US and Europe, the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve, and as well as the Bank of England, have brought interest rates down, have increased credit to companies in order to avoid bankruptcies. They have created all lines of credit. But in the case of the US, it was a very aggressive expansion in monetary policy that brought, and let me bring Keynes back to the conversation in another dressing, which is the liquidity trap. Let's say you look at the interest rate curve in the US. Let's say the Fed funds is at the zero bound, as well as a 2-year rate of treasuries, 3-year rates, 5-year rate, 10-year. 10-year is now rising, but you have a flat yield curve in which monetary policy has no more effectiveness. Now, so they decided to go, and Biden has proposed this $1.9 trillion fiscal stimulus. It's about 10% of GDP. It's a huge amount. In a situation like that, a lot of economists, many economists, are really warning that inflation may come back because it may overheat the economy. We really don't know exactly where the output gap is at this point because we don't know how much of the potential output was destructed by that. When the monetary expansion of that size started, the dollar has weakened. In relation to the euro, it has weakened. In relation to the real, in relation to all other currencies, it has weakened. Now let's assume that the US really goes to a situation like Larry Summers has been calling attention, in which you go to full employment, and I think Janet Yellen has recognized that. She's telling that probably by year end, US is going to be in full employment. And then inflation risk comes back, which is already showing up on the rise of the 10-year interest rate for treasury bonds. They will have to rise interest rates. That will weaken the dollar. That is going to produce effects on other countries. Well, I describe it that because I want to pick Europe, not UK. I mean the European Union, and more than the monetary union. I'm picking up the euro area. The euro area is not a country. It's a collection of countries. Each one has its own fiscal policy. So they cannot do the same type of fiscal policy as the US does. What they have done, under the leadership of Merkel and friends, they decided to create a $750 billion euro stimulus to investments in infrastructure in countries less developed in the euro area, like Italy, like Spain, like Poland. It's not going to be immediate because they will have to look at the projects which make sense. So it's a much more long-term reaction. What I think is a much better reaction than the US is a reaction in which you are trying to increase productivity by doing investments in infrastructure that generates externalities. And it's a spending that through the multiplier can also bring the demand upwards. Europe is not an optimum currency area. And I understand when Britain decided not to join the euro area because they recognized that it was not an optimum currency area. So they decided to join the European Union. That sort of deal didn't work. But I think this is a cost for Europe. It's a cost for Britain. But the way Britain and Europe are behaving and reacting to this COVID, I think is much better than the one I see of the US. If you could tell me what are your thoughts about that, I would thank you very much. And it was an excellent presentation. Thank you, Lord MERVYN KING.
Thank you very much, Alfonso. We see questions from the audience for some questions. And, I apologize. I asked
Federico, non si sente, Federico, non si sente più.
I think we have a radical uncertainty event happening now.
I think we have, Federico has frozen.
Yeah.
He may rejoin. Shall I start to give my responses and reactions to the sets of comments? I'm very grateful for you all to participating in this. They were very elegant and well-informed sets of comments. And I can't do justice to them all, but I'll try to pick up the main points. Let me start with Daniele Capezzone. I basically just agree with almost everything that you said. One of the sad aspects of the debate on Brexit in the United Kingdom was that the public debate never really focused, or the political debate never really focused on the real issues. The real issue concerning Brexit was that the UK, many people in the UK wanted our parliament to set our laws and weren't really prepared to delegate that, particularly to an institution which doesn't always seem to respect the European treaty. So the constitutional basis of many of the decisions were unclear. But the entire legal framework, the civil law versus the common law, is very different. And that did impose quite significant challenges. If you go back to when Britain joined what was then the common market in the early 1970s, the reason for joining was a complete lack of national self-confidence in Britain about our economic performance. We were then known as the sick man of Europe. We were struggling. The 1970s was one of the worst decades of our economic performance. And there was a rather narrow view that joining the common market, which became the EU, would solve our economic problems. And people ignored the fact that every other member of the common market had a political vision for the EU, which we never shared. And over many decades, British governments of both parties refused to engage with that and pretended that the EU was purely an economic issue. So that when the campaign came on the Brexit referendum, although the passions that were ignited by it on both sides were motivated by political reasons, it was very strange that both sides tried to come up with completely spurious arguments as to why either leaving the EU would mean that GDP would fall by 7.8% or some other very precise number, or that we would have lots of extra money to spend on the National Health Service. Again, a bogus number. And I think that people became sort of disillusioned with this, and the political class failed to understand that they had never really engaged with the political aspirations of the EU. And so actually it should have been rather natural for us to say, look, we're not in the euro area. We understand that if you want to construct a successful euro area, you will want to pursue a higher degree of fiscal and political integration. We understand that, but we don't want to be part of it. We need to go our separate ways. The EU didn't come up with any proposal for having different degrees of membership. I think if there had been a proposal by the EU to say that the inner ring of members in the euro area would have a different degree of political integration than those countries outside the euro area, it would have been actually fairly straightforward to come up with an agreement which would have allowed us to stay in. But anyway, we're out. And I don't think the economic effects in the long run will be terribly significant. Perhaps that's one area where I disagree a little bit with Rainer, that I just don't think in the long run, although there are frictions now and will be, I think, for several years as we put flesh on the agreement in terms of what it means commercially. But I do think that the essence of what the city offers the world financial system is not really going to be challenged. The number of jobs that have left London is much smaller than people initially feared or argued would occur. And the most important thing, and this relates to both what Rainer said and also Ambassador Terzi, is that Britain is and always will be European. There was absolutely no suggestion in Britain during the campaign that we wanted to opt out of being in Europe. We wanted to opt out of an institution, the European Union. And it is very striking that I personally felt very warm about some of the things that Rainer said, because he talked about Genoa and the Cross of St. George, Richard Lionheart. Well, that Cross of St. George is actually the cross of the Order of the Garter, of which I have the privilege to be a member, one of only 24 members. And it's on my cloak. The cross is on my cloak and on the badge I wear when I go to Windsor Castle to meet the Queen and the other members of the Garter, Order of the Garter. So we always will be part of Europe. And my guess is, and this picks up a point that Ambassador Terzi made, that there will be lots of opportunities now post-Brexit to strengthen the relationships that work well. So rather than having an argument in the European Council about proposals to move further forward or not on political union, which is now not an argument that we will engage in, the collective security issues, which require us to try and create a stronger alliance, I think, with our partners in the United States. I think that once the issue about having a joined up approach to China is going to be absolutely central to our foreign policies in the future. It is very, very important. It's not going well at present, but I think that over the next 5 to 10 years, the liberal democracies of the West will realize that they have a real interest in having a joined up approach to dealing with China, because it's not that we want to create conflict with China, but China has made it very clear recently that it simply rejects many of the values that we all share in the West. And I think the immediate consequence of COVID-19 is that once we escape from this and are allowed to travel again, there will be a period of what I will describe as pure joy, as British tourists can once again come to Italy, Italians can come to London. I think the opportunity to meet up again will actually be an experience where people will realize that that friendship is very deep and long-standing. And just as COVID-19, I think, has brought us together within each nation, it's very striking. I went for vaccination last week, and I'm very struck that right across the United Kingdom, as more and more people are vaccinated, there is a sense that it's bringing us all together in a very positive spirit. And I think that can happen across Europe once we can escape COVID-19 and adjust to what I think will be a fairly straightforward transition for most people to Brexit, despite the fact that there will be some degree of friction. Paolo Savonis talked about the supply crisis. I totally agree. It is a crisis of supply and not demand. And I think that this is a problem of many of the models that economists have been using, that they tend to think the model must be right. And there are some things called shocks, which we never go out and measure or observe. It's a concept, and we use it to try to square the model with our observations of the world. I don't think that's a very helpful way of thinking about things, and I think it's a big mistake, which is also linked to the point that Alfonso Pastore made about COVID not being a traditional demand or supply shock. It's a combination of the two, but it's a unique shock, and we need to actually understand the true nature of that shock, not label it in the traditional model way of thinking about these things. So let me finish with a comment about the issue of the Biden successful vaccination regime, and then moving on to the stimulus proposals. Minister Tremonti talked in great convincing fashion about the need to think more deeply about the monetary and financial structures of our economies. And I think this is a lesson that President Biden and his team would do well to learn. The argument that I would put forward is the following, and this is the answer to Alfonso Pastore. The argument for going big, to use the terminology of Janet Yellen in the United States, is not an argument for a fiscal stimulus to boost aggregate demand. Aggregate demand, I don't think, is going to be our big problem once we are released from the restrictions at present to deal with COVID-19. There is a significant amount of pent-up consumer demand reflected in the very high savings on average, which have been built up in the household sectors of most of our economies. So there's likely to be quite a boost of spending in the immediate aftermath of the restrictions ending. Whether that continues is not entirely clear, but there's no reason why it couldn't. We're not short of, I think, total spending power. The reason for going big was a different reason. It was in order to ensure that businesses did not fail because the government had shut them down, or because people were too frightened to go to work, use public transport, and spend on the things that they used to spend money on. And there was a very good case, in my view, for large fiscal transfers from taxpayers in general to the businesses that were affected in this way, in order that they would maintain employment. So the furlough schemes in Europe were, I think, exactly the right way to approach it, as Signor Pastore suggested. This was a much better approach, I think, than the American one. The American approach, I think, is in danger of confusing this need for fiscal support with an argument for fiscal stimulus to boost aggregate demand. The problems with the Biden package, I think, are that it is very big. It's around 10% of GDP, which is the same order of magnitude as the support packages in Europe during 2020 and the beginning of 2021. But 2020 is finished now. We're out of that. The Americans are a bit late to put in place a big package of fiscal support. And we don't need a big package of that magnitude to boost aggregate spending, particularly when central banks, I think, have pursued a strategy of monetary expansion in a situation that didn't really justify it. As I pointed out in my remarks, back in the financial crisis, central banks expanded the money supply by doing quantitative easing in order to prevent the money supply from falling, not to boost it to growing at double-digit levels. What's happened now, in a very different set of circumstances, is that the temporary dislocation last March in financial markets that was used to justify significant quantitative easing corrected itself fairly quickly, and the monetary easing was not reversed. So we now have monetary aggregates growing at unprecedentedly high rates for many of the countries, highest rates for several decades. Now, that doesn't have an automatic impact on inflation, but it certainly should raise question marks about what's going on. And once you see that, to compound that with a large fiscal package, which is not designed to give support directly to those businesses affected by COVID-19, but it's just a general handout to the population as a whole, either in direct checks or in support to boost aggregate demand, is, I think, probably a mistake. But we will see what happens in the future. But all of this, I think, is part of my concern that the radical uncertainty that Rainer Mazera said we should all accept, but you know, it's very difficult to shake economists out of their traditional way of thinking. But what we have to shake them out of, I think, is a belief that the models we have are accurate descriptions of the world, as opposed to something which would give us some insight. But when we're faced with a unique problem like COVID-19, we really have to think it through for ourselves from the beginning. And I think that is true of all the issues that all of you raised, whether it was the approach to China, the future opportunities for cooperation in Europe, the adjustment to Brexit, all of these issues, I think, are where we need to think it through for ourselves, drawing on economics, anthropology, diplomacy, history for insights, but not believing that there is a textbook answer that you can just turn a handle and some expert will give you the right answer. Thank you all very much indeed for your remarks, which I found immensely stimulating and helpful. Thank you.
I thank Daniele Capezzone, Rainer Mazera, Giulio Terzi, Giulio Tremonti, Paolo Savona, and Afonso Pastore for their remarks. And I am really grateful to Lord MERVYN KING for his outstanding presentation. I think it would be very inspiring for our policymakers and philosophers, I would say. The proceedings of this webinar will be published and hopefully will have a diffusion which is that it needs. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much to our audience. Let me thank also Università Guglielmo Marconi and La Verità in Panorama, our media partner and our co-organizer. Thank you very much, MERVYN.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you all in Rome before too long.
Thank you.
Bye.